Thank you very much, Aaron, for a quick and succinct summary of a really major document. I'd like to invite the panellists to come up now, please, to offer some responses. We have Dr. Angeline Barrett from the University of Bristol. Angeline, would you like to, so people can see who you are, in case you don't know Angeline already? Bridget Crompton from DFID. And David Archer from ActionAid.
There's two.
Okay, Angeline, would you like to start?
Right, I need to use the mic. Is this working? Can you hear me? Okay, one of the disadvantages of a tent seems to be it doesn't have fantastic acoustics. Thank you, Aaron. It's no small feat, as Caroline said, to summarise, to give the highlights of such a meaty report, and you know, as always, ably supported with some ingenious visual representation of data there. What I'll pick up on is I want to just talk briefly about measurement in the GMR, and also how the GMR goes beyond numbers. One of the things that the GMR has done consistently is to use measurement to identify marginalised and disadvantaged groups. And this is very different. There is a lot of measurement going on, as Aaron said, at different levels. There's a lot of measurement of learning going on. There's a lot of preoccupation with what more measurement we should do and how we can make measurement better. And I think we need to distinguish between the different ways in which measurement is being used and the different discourses around it. And I think it's to be applauded for using measurement in order to make perhaps what's not so evident and what's not so visible, which groups are being disadvantaged, whether they're in or out of school. A danger with relying on quantitative findings, numbers, is always that they kind of carry that authority of objectivity. The very thing that gives it its strength can also be its weakness, because we're then invited to suspend value-based judgments about the data. But Education for All does have a value basis. It has a value basis in the right to education. And it's very important that the data is consistently interpreted with reference to and to support the right to education. We need to be explicit about the limitations of measurements. In the early days of the GMR, particularly when it came to the area of the sixth goal, quality, the word proxy was used quite a bit. There was a lot less data around. There was a lot less data on learning. But it wasn't the report was very explicit in recognising that the data we had on learning was a proxy. There were indicators, which I'm glad Aaron used a lot. We need to recognise their indicators, that it doesn't displace, that we are able to measure learning doesn't displace the rest of the debate that goes on about quality. And you go back to the Dakar framework, and quality is not conceptualized just as learning. Quality is conceptualized in terms of systems and processes, such as curriculum and assessment. And one of the things that's good to see, actually, is the chapter 6 that looks at education for all. The sixth goal for quality does go beyond looking at learning outcomes, I think much more so than some previous global monitoring reports, to look at things such as not just what learning what the findings are, but how are we monitoring learning, at what levels are we monitoring learning, are we investing in teachers? Tends to be a discourse around teachers in terms of teacher training. I'd like to see much more talk about teacher professionalism to see professional learning as something that's ongoing and it can't just be injected at different points during teachers' career, because then I think we'll think much more differently about how we can strengthen quality. Resources, process and governance. We also need to look at who's measuring what, and who's interpreting it. This is a process by which information is collected from countries around the world, and then it's packaged up and it's interpreted mainly within Western metropolitan centres. I'm not saying don't do it, but we really do need to be aware of that. And it's very good to hear that there's now an emphasis on doing much more at the national level, taking and much more activity in terms of measurement and interpretation, and the capacity that that builds at the national level. But the Global Monitoring Report does go beyond the numbers. They make the headline. I mean, it is its remit to report against the Education for All goals. But each chapter in the report does go beyond, goes behind the numbers, as we said, to identify marginalised groups, key issues, make recommendations, sometimes highlighting contextual differences. It'd be good to see more of that. Going forward with the GEM, as what different things have been done in different places. But it's also kind of developed some important themes and concepts. And you can see the work of previous GMRs being carried forward. So you're seeing in different chapters looking at the issue of private providers, private-public partnerships. The word marginalisation in itself was developed by the 2010 GMR, the treatment of skills and education in conflict areas. Those are some examples. I'd like to see it do more to make us look at the systemic level. The danger of looking at results is always that they can work to focus on the individuals. That's totally consistent with the right to education. But we can also need to see how it is that things like curriculum, like assessment, how they create the conditions that enable learning. So to wind up, I think three main points that I'll pull out. As we move on to the gem of the report that we've been promised for next year, I'd like to see it do more to emphasise diversity, contextual diversity, using perhaps case studies more prominently in order to show us the different strategies that are being used in different places for implementing education for all. I'd like to see targets and indicators clearly positioned as being proxies that are partial, and again, perhaps more use of case studies, qualitative description, that places that gets in behind those indicators, links what is measurable to what is not measurable. And I'd like to see it to continue to develop and build consistently on the intellectual work that it's done so far, within an arena where perhaps not so much of that intellectual work is going on, and to carry on with its thematic work. We've had some really, meaty GMRs over the years. That have nevertheless crisply defined concepts. And then now I can see the work in Chapter 9, which you didn't talk about, Erin, but the Chapter 9 showing how they're trying to feed, the GMR team are trying to feed that into the debate on the education goal for 2015 to 2030. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Angeline. And if we could pass the mic to Bridget Crompton from DFID to offer her response.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about innovation, but first I have to make this innovation work. Are we there? Okay, great. Hello everyone, I'm from the Department for International Development, so I'm going to try and give a slightly different perspective on this in terms of looking back and looking forward a bit on the key shifts in education from a DFID perspective and also what it might mean for us collectively as we look to the next 15 years. So thanks, Aaron, that was a great presentation, and as you showed, we have come a long way, but of course there's still a long way to go, particularly if we want these next 15 years to be remembered, not just for access, but really a change in quality and the skills that children, adolescents, and all entrants in education actually learn. So I'm going to start with some words about the stock take for the last 15 years and what it's meant for DFID, what it might mean for us as key players looking forward to how we can deliver better and faster progress, and then something around the GMR itself. So we've seen that we've made reasonably good progress on access, getting girls and boys into school, and some progress in particular on getting girls through school, but although we know they're most likely to be left behind. I think what's been really important has been the strategic shift that you mentioned of a global recognition of the priority to improve quality and learning at all levels of education. And I think for us, what we are particularly interested in is starting with the basics. What does it mean to ensure that boys and girls who go to school actually stay in school and learn something in those early years as a foundation for going forward? And for us at DFID, that has been the start of a shift to really place learning and girls more at the heart of all our policy and programme work. It's led to an enhanced understanding of the multiple levels of disadvantage that children, and in particular girls, face in accessing education. It's led to an increased focus on education in emergency and protracted crises, recognising that those are the children that are going to be most likely to be out of school. And we've seen that in some of the new work we've started now in Syria to really work with Syrian refugees as the no generation left behind. It's also led, and I think this has been a really important shift, to more focus on data and evidence. And we're really pleased to see that there are new tools coming forward on how you measure early grade reading and numeracy to really enhance what we know about where the gaps are and what students are learning, what are the bottlenecks and why they're not in school. And as we've seen from some of these early surveys, in particular the lower income countries, there's probably kids are learning less and more stark data than we really imagined was the case. And linked to that, it's led to a stronger focus on evidence and a more ambitious research programme in DFID that's looking not just at some of the specific elements such as early grade reading, but how to make the system as a whole work more effectively. So my second point is really about performance and how we as donors, civil society, academics, all of us in the room today, are we doing enough and what more can we do? We've seen some increased progress, I think, on coordination and joining up together with the Global Partnership for Education as an example of showing how we can work more effectively at the national level with governments and different stakeholders. But we're seeing that financing and targeting investment on actions that can make the biggest difference is still a major challenge. So looking back, I think our biggest message would be that business as usual is not going to deliver the step change that we want to see. And that leaves the question of how can we work better collectively to make this decade, or the next 15 years, one that's going to be remembered more for building human capital and equipping the next generation with skills they need to take part in growth and prosperity. So I'd like to suggest 3 areas where we might want to give more focus to. One is we're not going to do it alone. We've seen that donor funding is not going to fill this enormous gap that's looming. So I think there's a real urgency to bring in new players, new forms of financing and new voices. We need to be harnessing innovative financing and an enhanced role for communities. And it would be good to really get others to raise their voices, not just us in the education community, but this really needs to be seen as a collective effort where there's more impetus required. The second is we need to be taking more of a whole systems approach with a stronger focus on governance and mutual accountability to make the system and the financing that we do have work as efficiently and effectively as it can. And my last point is on innovation. There are a lot of new ways to deliver education, and there are digital technologies can be a mechanism. So I think one of the questions that we are looking at more is really how can we use rising evidence and digital technologies to test what works to improve quality, transform and deliver better and affordable education. And actually, I'm going to give a little quote from one of our chief scientific officer who can say this much more eloquently than I can. But he gave us a really inspiring quote recently, which is that education is going to look radically different in the next 20 to 15 years. It is starting from a low base, but for the first time, there is now sustained experimentation with new methods, and we can expect incrementally better health and agriculture, but we should expect and aim for substantially better quality in education delivery. So let's end with that. That's kind of, I think, an inspirational thought as we go forward. On the GMR, Aaron, you're in a pivotal position. We know and commend the GMR for the incredible role it does play in tracking data trends and unpacking policy priorities like teachers or education in emergencies. And having this kind of global product has really raised the bar and promoted greater accountability, as well as shining the spotlight on where there are real gaps and urgency for more delivery, such as around equity or marginalised groups. But as with everything, we think there's some room for improvement. And what we would like to see, what we note in this one, is the low attention to really measuring learning outcomes in the stock gap, in the stock take. And going forward, this is an area where we would really like to see a bit more emphasis on how we can measure learning outcomes. And also, going forward, we'd like GMR to continue to do what it's also doing really well. And we think the database it has developed, such as around wide and disaggregating by different levels of disadvantage and by gender, is a real comparative advantage of the GMR. And we encourage you strongly going forward to keep innovating and developing some of those analytical tools that will help us all understand better what's happening. Thank you.
Hi. I'm David Archer from ActionAid, and the first thing to say, I think, is that the GMR has become a hugely important resource for all of us across civil society over the last 15 years. It's been valuable for us in the north, it's been valuable in the south, it's become a definitive reference point, and I think everyone who's been involved in it deserves praise for setting such a high standard and maintaining it. Mic's not working. Okay, maybe I need to press it again. Is that better? It's working now. Okay, so it's a hugely valuable resource. Now, I've only got 10 minutes. I'm going to have to focus, and I think the one way to focus is to focus on the one thing that I remember most vividly from the Dakar Framework for Action, and which I think is probably the most often quoted section of that, which is famously the Dakar Pledge, that no country that has got a credible plan will be thwarted for lack of resources to implement that plan. And I think if I'm going to focus on anything, let me focus on finance, because Aaron, you had to rush over it at the end of your presentation. I think that, as this Global Monitoring Report observes, this has probably been the single biggest failure in the last 15 years in the EFA period. In fact, of course, as Aaron has noted, that none of the goals were met. And even the universalisation of primary education, which became an MDG and gained such huge attention, was not met. We fell short, and possibly one of the biggest reasons why we fell short was the lack of resources, the lack of delivery on the promises around financing. So I want to focus a little bit on that. I think we've heard that about 10% of aid goes to education. That's, I think, personally inadequate, but it's even more shocking that much of the aid that does go to education doesn't go to basic education, doesn't go to the countries in most need, and is in fact now declining. I think there's been, in fact, in general, a move away from harmonisation of aid and coordination. There was perhaps a peak after the Paris and Accra aid effectiveness times that we thought that there would be a real commitment to coordination and harmonisation. And apart from the Global Partnership for Education, I don't think we see that happening very much in practice. I think the GPE, though hugely important, is only managing about $1 billion a year. Much more is needed. I think personally the Global Monitoring Report could probably have been and should have been over the years tougher on holding the donor community to account for failing to deliver on that commitment. It's sometimes done some work in tracking, but perhaps a bit more naming and shaming would have been good. It's difficult because that's biting the hand that feeds you as well, so I recognise that's not always a very easy thing to do. I think, relatively speaking, the domestic financing story has been better, but when one looks at the domestic financing story, it's mostly as a result of GDP growth rather than significant increases in the share of the budget going to education. My personal view is that, and as the GMR itself notes, aid to education is dwarfed by the domestic financing for education, and if we're serious about making progress on the goals, we need to pay much more attention to domestic financing and the extent to which aid can leverage increases in domestic financing. This seems to me to be the big story. It is, I think, quite shocking, one of the statistics in the report, that a huge burden of financing for education in low-income countries falls on households, something like 42% of budgets, compared to high-income countries where only about 27% of the budgets of the total spending on education is dependent on household spending. We need to pay huge, I would argue, attention to increasing 4 S's, and I shall touch on each of those briefly. Increase the share of the budget going to education, increase the size of the budget overall, increase the sensitivity of the budget, and increase the scrutiny of the budget if we're serious about this. In Chion recently, there was the commitment in the declaration to the countries should be spending 15 to 20% of their national budgets on education. At present, only about 13.7% is spent on education. It also commits to 4 to 6% of GDP. At the moment, I think the global average is about 5%, but for low-income countries, much closer to 4%. And some countries are way, way off target. And it's quite interesting to note that the countries which are often got the biggest education challenges are the ones who are furthest away from hitting those benchmarks on financing of education. Look at Pakistan and Nigeria, for example. I don't think that the education community has done enough to engage with ministries of finance and to have a strategic dialogue about the case for financing of education. There's been a big gap, and perhaps the monitoring report of Future needs to do more to help the community make that bridge. It is, I think, a structural problem that ministries of finance around the world are working to medium-term expenditure frameworks of 3 to 5 years, when within which spending on education is just like pouring money down the drain, because it's a constantly spending ministry, and you don't get any of the substantial social economic returns that you would if you look over an 8 to 10 or 15-year period. The fact is that investments in education are long-term investments, and all of the incentive structures for ministries of finance are short-term or medium-term, and we need to crack that and really break through that if we're going to make the case to ministries of finance that investment in education is something to be valued. However, I think we've spent far too much time. I mean, as has been noted, is still, if all countries were to hit that 20% of the budget going to education, there'd still be a $22 billion target. So that seems like a huge challenge. And I think one of the biggest problems is that we've spent not enough time looking at the size of government budgets overall. It's something which the Global Monitoring Report picked up a little bit last year by focusing a little bit on tax and expanding the tax base. And it did show that 67 countries, I think, that were studied could have generated an additional $153 billion for investment in education had they done relatively straightforward things to expand the domestic tax base. There was a fascinating fact that $1 of aid spent on strengthening revenue authorities in low-income countries yielded $350 of return. You would have thought that's about the most sustainable and best use of aid I could possibly think of, but only 0.1% of aid is spent on strengthening revenue authorities. That seems to me pretty problematic, and as education campaigners, we should be flagging this because we gain a lot from expanding the tax base. I was very pleased to see that this year the Global Monitoring Report started to pick up and quote Thomas Piketty's work, which I think is hugely important in this area. Piketty observes that the countries which have got a very low tax to GDP ratio, under 10%, 10 to 15%, really are ceremonial states only symbolically existing. And if you want to build a social state, you need to hit at least 20% of tax to GDP ratio. And I think when one starts looking at that and strategies to expand the tax to GDP ratio, that's when you start getting serious about expanding education spending. The work that ActionAid has done on this shows that about $138 billion a year is given away in developing countries as tax incentives or tax holidays to multinational companies, which are, generally speaking, not needed because most companies would invest anyway, but the companies will take those holidays if they're offered. The Mbeki panel on illicit financial flows in Africa, which reported earlier this year, flagged that $50 billion a year is leaving Africa as a result of aggressive tax avoidance by multinational companies. If we're serious about expanding spending on education, we need to get serious about addressing issues of the tax base of countries, and we need to be championing these arguments because education is the sector which probably stands most to gain from an expanded domestic tax base. And I think the GMR and in future the Global Education Monitoring Report could do a lot more. There's a huge opportunity coming up with the Financing for Development meeting happening in Addis in July, where there is call for a United Nations intergovernmental body on tax, which would be empowered and resourced to set global rules and enforce those rules. There's quite a momentum behind that as a call, and we should be, as an education community, taking that seriously. At the moment, global tax rules, of course, are set by OECD, which means the rich countries are setting the global tax rules and developing countries are disadvantaged. Let me continue because I won't have much time, but I think as well as looking at the size, the share of the budget going to education, the size of the budget, we have to take seriously looking at the sensitivity of the budget. Is it being spent where it's most needed? And I think the Global Monitoring Report picks up on the importance of looking at equitable spending. And I think this is probably going to become even more important in the coming years because we now have very ambitious education goals set in Incheon. And a lot of developing country governments could say, well, our investment in upper secondary and higher education is an investment which is consistent with the Sustainable Development Goals. And you could see investment which should be most urgently going to basic education getting diverted into upper secondary and higher education and being quite distorting and benefiting an elite. So I think really focusing on equity-based investment as being the most important thing. It's very good work, I think, done by Pasi Solberg in Harvard, flagging that when governments invest in education with a focus on equity, the outcomes from that system are improved. And it's only when countries focus obsessively on achieving improved outcomes that they often fall down the global tables. So equity investments, equity-focused investments make a lot of sense. Strengthening the scrutiny of the budget is also, I think, hugely important. We know that a lot of money in education is wasted. There's a lot of misuse of resources, a lot of corruption. I think the Global Monitoring Report this year flags up some of the very important work done by civil society organisations in independently tracking education budgets, in monitoring, demystifying how budgets are spent and trying to see what happens in practice. Does the money arrive in schools when it should? I think that work is going to be hugely important. And I think that we are hopeful that in 2017, the Global Education Monitoring Report may focus on accountability as an issue, something which is under discussion at the moment. And if that was the case, I think that would be very valuable because we need to get serious about accountability, and civil society actors, I think, play a very important role there. A final couple of reflections. One is that I think for too long there has been a focus on accountability of developing country governments towards donors in some sense, set by these international targets. And I think we need to move away from that model and absolutely focus on governments being held to account by their own citizens. And that's why civil society actors play a hugely important role. Broad-based civil society coalitions that can hold their own governments to account is what we need, and we need to break this sort of post-colonial model, which is a sort of north-south, we're going to keep an eye on what you're spending your money on. Let's really invest in building a domestic accountability and focus on domestic budgets, because that's where the difference will be felt. And that's enough. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much to our panel, David, Angeline and Bridget. I'm going to ask you all to sit there, if that's okay. We have about 20 minutes now for our questions, reflections and other things, and if I don't mind, if you don't mind, this is not an opportunity for a mini lecture from the floor. Could you keep your questions in the spirit of today fairly brief and focused? And over to you. You were burning to ask something. Have we got a runner with the mic? Is that you, Sarah, running with the microphone? We want that one. I'll have another one. If you could just quickly introduce yourself and then ask your question, that would be great. Thanks. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Leandra Alonso, and I will save introduction and go straight to the theme because I have something to say. First of all, I'm very happy for the last speech. Was very genuine one, and which put the fingers in the real problem. And I would like to say as well, nowadays, the modern society, we are facing a multidisciplinary problem. So when education comes without observe few aspects of politics and economics, I'm afraid we're going to be 2030 back dealing with the same problem, with the same achievements. Because a monetary system where the private banks print money for nothing and then lend us with interest, we never will get the people educated, because information won't let the people allow it to happen. Okay. So I use educators, researchers to look into resource-based economy and a new monetary system to help our target for education for all be achieved as real and serious matter. Because otherwise, we are just drawing eyes and we won't get anywhere without solving that prior problem to the lack of education in our world. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to take two more, and I've seen two hands. So first Keith, then Alba, and then back to the panel, and then we'll take another round. Keith, you don't have to run, Sarah.
Thank you. Keith Lewin from University of Sussex. Another distinguished report in a long series which has done the world a lot of good. But I think, like many of its predecessors, it's much stronger on what rather than why. And I think the challenge for the report, whatever it turns out to look like in the next generation, is to say more about why and perhaps less about what. It really is wonderful if India only has 1 out of 122 children out of school. Those of us who work on India find this one quite difficult to come to terms with. The role of the Global Monitoring Report, in part, is to call governments to account on the statistics that they offer to their people as well as to the international community. I don't know what the real number is, but I don't think it's 1 out of 122. The question I want to put to you and to put to the panel is really the counterfactual question. We've not only had 15 years since Dhaka, we've actually had 25 years since Jomtien. Those of you who've looked at the report and have looked at the Enchun statement, which we saw produced 2 weeks ago, see a remarkable similarity rather than a difference. What is claimed to be a new agenda, it may be new in marketing terms, but in substance it's difficult to see what's actually new. There is a counterfactual, and it's the one that has to be challenged, and it's the one that may lie behind whatever happens in Addis about the pledges of finance and so on. It's about the confidence in what has been done. It's about the confidence that we have that aid, ODA, to education makes a difference. Because you have to be able to answer the question, and I don't think the GMR report really does this, is to say, well look, if all this hadn't taken place, many of these countries, Vietnam would have developed without the GMR, without the FA. And it would have developed in a different way to Malawi or to Mexico. The examples we give are often those of middle-income countries with relatively good infrastructure and successful stories. The examples we don't give are the ones where it doesn't work for all sorts of reasons many people are familiar with. The question is this: what is the counterfactual that you would put your nail your flag to over the last 15 years? Let's take it from Dakar. If we didn't have EFA, if we didn't have these global meetings, what are the successes? What really made a difference? Because there are things that we should celebrate, and what frankly was difficult to justify.
Thanks, Keith. We'll just take the last one for this round from Alba.
Alba de Souza, and my question is to David. David, you talked about civil society needing to hold governments into account. Please give me some examples of how you would, how civil society could hold governments into account. And part of that would be as well, what pressure can civil society organizations place on donors, European donors, because Britain is contributing its share, European donors to contribute to the financial pot? Thank you.
Thanks very much. Aaron said in facing the London audience that he knew it would be a critical audience, so well done, and I'll hand straight over. Do you want to talk first, Aaron, in response? And then other members of the panel may like to.
So thanks very much for the comments from my colleagues here on the panel and also from the questions. I'm not going to try and respond to all of them because I also would like other people to speak up or have the chance to speak up. I think that there are a lot of, I actually see a difference in the Incheon Declaration relative to the EFA and even Jomtien, and I think the key issue is really around learning and outcomes, and the emphasis on skills and numeracy and literacy and not just on access. So I think that there is the shift, which has been ongoing over the last 10 years, whether or not we will have measures to be able to look at these kinds of things. Certainly in the short term, it's quite problematic, but I think that there's a lot of different initiatives underway that may enable us, as this report tried to point out, and I made mention of in my presentation, I think there's a lot of ongoing initiatives at the country level that could be improved upon along these lines. I think that one of the ways that we still have a hard time, and I don't think the report has done a good job of being able to look at this, is the EFA agenda was a very holistic, comprehensive agenda that was meant to the extent that countries could develop plans along each of the different dimensions throughout the life course, or at least at all the different levels, that there would be synergies that would enable for some very serious progress to be made. And here it's very difficult to actually indicate even cases that we can point to in which countries have made sustained progress on all the different EFA targets. So we see countries that have made progress on particular EFA areas, whether it be early childhood or the UPE, to some extent gender parity. These are linked sometimes around learning, but to indicate cases in which there has been substantial progress that has built some very serious synergies across all the different aspects of the EFA, I think we have very few cases. And in some sense, this is probably the way in which, both as a monitoring mechanism, but certainly as a way to hold countries to account. They obligated themselves to this comprehensive agenda, but few of them undertook policy initiatives across all the different areas. If one is to draw a inference from this into the new agenda, which now has 7 targets, 3 means of implementation, and is even more ambitious because it includes such things as TVET, technical vocational education training, and higher education, that it'll be extremely difficult to envision countries making progress across such an ambitious holistic agenda. And so what we see happening is a lot of narrowing that we'll focus on these particular things in the early grades, around learning outcomes, whatever it may be, trying to universalize access to the secondary level. There's all kinds of, I think, positioning going on in terms of narrowing the agenda. Anyway, there are many different aspects here that I think the report needs to take on, and as was indicated by David, The theme that the advisory board that met earlier this week has decided on for the 2017 report. The 2016 report will be focused on the new monitoring framework for the Sustainable Development Goal number 4 and each of the different targets, which in and of itself is quite a challenge, but also looking at the linkages with some of the other Sustainable Development Goals. The 2017 report will be examining issues around accountability in the broadest sense, and not just holding countries to account, but also this kind of mutual and much more comprehensive notions of accountability. So we will actually begin working on this in the months to come, and this is also a call for those who perhaps wish to contribute something to this themed report. We'd be very interested to get proposals along those lines.
Is there anyone else on the panel like to respond? David?
Two quick points. On the first question, I just want to, I'm often asked, well, surely the private sector's got a hugely important role to play in education. And I always say, yes, it's got a hugely important role to play. Pay your taxes. Pay a fair amount of taxes in the countries where you're making a profit. That's the most important thing you can do. And we do know that this is often not the case. I don't think the private sector should be doing what I think we're increasingly seeing, which is promoting commercial chains of low-cost private schools, which I think are better characterised as for-profit, low-quality private schools, which exploit the aspirations of poor parents with very little gain to them. I think we need to be challenging that, and it flies in the face of the success stories that we've heard, in fact, today from the GMR about abolition of user fees having been such a huge cause of the gains in enrolment that have been made in the last 15 years. On the civil society question, just very briefly, I think one of the big differences now compared to where we were in 2000 is that back in 2000 there were only a handful of national education, civil society education coalitions. There are now in about 80 countries broad-based civil society coalitions involving NGOs, teacher unions, about 5,000 organisations involved, often really trying to engage with national government in a constructive dialogue, pulling together learning and influencing policy and monitoring of progress. It's something which has been supported with the Commonwealth Education Fund a few years back, and now through the Civil Society Education Fund of the Global Partnership for Education. I think that's a hugely important role, because you need to start bringing together different voices. It's very difficult for governments to dialogue with civil society in the abstract. You need to have an organised constituency that brings different actors together to constructively engage in that dialogue, and that has been happening. I think it's one of the biggest transformative stories of the last 15 years is how much that has happened, and I would like to have seen the GMR pick up on that a little bit more than it did.
Anyone from panel, any other responses? We take another round of questions? Yeah? Okay, another round of questions. You? I don't know your name, I don't know your name, and I don't know your name, I'm afraid. I think that's probably a good thing. Here. Mic coming from behind. Yes. Could you quickly say your name, please?
Hi, my name is Toyin Olacampo. I'm the CEO of an organisation called CSR Children. This issue of quality has been ongoing for quite a few years. I also did some research at the IOE, that's now UCL. And when you're looking at Nigeria, you can't begin to look at quality when you have issues of poor teacher training, you have infrastructural problems. I mean, I have worked, in terms of reviewing schools in Lagos State, and you've got a teacher who's gotten up at 4 in the morning, probably hasn't slept well overnight because she hasn't had any electricity, managed to get to school after taking maybe 3 buses and walked for 3 hours, whatever it is. But I've been to inspect schools where you have teachers sleeping at their desks, because they're so tired. And of course, children are doing the same. So when you have those issues, how do you begin to look at quality? And my final statement is that when we're looking at these goals, we have to look at Africa in a different light. We cannot use the same goals for Scandinavia, for example, and Nigeria. That's all I have to say.
Thank you. And there's someone just behind you.
Hi, Sally Gowland from BBC Media Action. I'm just quite interested in what the panel think about, particularly picking up on the question of the why question and why things happen, and what what education is, what they'd like to see in terms of education, in terms of what it's for. We know that education can do so much, and what are we interested in terms of, is it poverty reduction, is it economic equality, is it gender equality? It's just an interesting question to go beyond, like, we have education, but what do we want it to do for these different countries, and can we pull out examples of different countries to see what sort of benefits it's had, other than, you know, the provision of education, sort of education for what, basically?
Good question. And Ved, over there? Yeah.
Very much.
Yeah.
And this is Ved Goel from the Council of Education in the Commonwealth. I have two observations to make. I think first, I think the team which has made this report ready need to be congratulated for the work well done. But the number which has been given as 84 million children, less children out of school, I don't know which data you have used. There are three kinds of data which are available in the countries. The number which are actually enrolled on the register, the number which is marked present in the register, and number of bodies which are sitting in the class. Which data has been used to say that 84 million children, less children, are out of school? Because there are countries, I have the personal experience of seeing this, that there are three, and why it is done? Because if you show more on enrollment in the school, you get more teachers. The second observation is, there are some countries which have got no retention policy. All these children are promoted to the secondary or lower secondary after the primary, and some countries have an end of primary examination. So when you say completion rate is so much, which figure are you, or how are you comparing these two streams of students? One who are coming from no retention policy, and the one who are coming from end of primary school examination. How about the learning achievement of these two groups? Thank you.
Thanks, Ved. If we could ask the panel to respond to those. Who'd like to go?
Well, I'll take some of the issues here. First of all, I would like to strengthen the point that was made by the colleague from Nigeria about the importance of looking at quality as a multidimensional concept that involves many different aspects. This was also brought out by my colleague, by Angelina here. The fixation or the preponderance of attention to learning outcomes is problematic, because it really does draw attention away from the enabling conditions for learning to take place, many of which you mentioned, and I think they're enormously important, and they need to be continued to be monitored and measured as we move forward in the upcoming targets. Whether or not Africa needs to be held to a different standard than other countries, certainly this is not foreseen in the universal agenda that's being put forward. Having said that, this is meant to be a member state-driven agenda in which member states are meant to take ownership and develop the means to both define, measure, and monitor at the national level those aspects of the new education target that are meant to be prioritized. So there's going to be a very different, shall we even call it, tension between the way in which some of these issues are being measured and monitored at the global level, with all the complications, many of which have just been mentioned by the colleague around the out-of-school children issue, and also looked at the national level. And I think one of the roles of the GMR, the GEM report going forward, is to listen very carefully and pay attention to national initiatives to monitor progress at that level, or even at the subnational level, that we can learn from and draw attention to as perhaps practices that could be shared across national contexts. So I think this is an issue going forward. There's absolutely no doubt in my mind that the out-of-school numbers that we make use of these are being generated through UNESCO's Institute for Statistics. They have many limitations. They do not tell you how many children are in school, retained in school. They don't tell you about one of the reasons, which is also a little bit what Keith was mentioning, why they don't make it past and complete the primary level or the secondary level. In our more nuanced case studies, we actually pay attention to those issues, and as have previous reports, to look at the difference between official enrollment data and also attendance figures. We know that these are very important kinds of relationships. Having said that, one of the big innovations of the GMR over the last few years is to make use of household survey evidence that does look at attendance and not just are you signed up on the official register. They also have problems because this is not system-wide and all kinds of sampling problems, and many children fall through the cracks, as colleagues here in the UK have brought attention to, and through household surveys, but nevertheless they put a much greater focus on attendance. And if we make mention of India, which was also brought to by Keith earlier, India has made enormous progress in reducing the official numbers of out-of-school children. They've made absolutely no progress in retaining those children who gain access. So that it's still 40% of all Indian children who start grade 1 who that drop out before the end of the primary cycle. So, these are some of the very key, I wouldn't say trade-offs, but certainly one of the more nuanced depictions that one needs to look at in every case, at every system, because they are being affected by very different kinds of factors. So I think your point is well taken, and the report has tried in different ways to capture these very different kinds of trends.
Thanks, Aaron. Bridget would like to respond as well.
Thank you. I think there's quite a challenging set of questions. I feel like I'm being hauled up in front of the minister and being asked to defend why we're still giving money to education so many years after Dakar when we haven't got great results. So I'll have a go. On quality, yeah, the unknown question. I think the scale of magnitude is much bigger to make a difference than it was for access. But we are seeing, and I think it's a challenge to all of us, what can we do more to really boost quality and learning in low-income environments? And I think governance and accountability, we know, plays a key role in that. We are seeing that school management, improving more accountability at that level, can help create a better environment for the school to function and learn better. We're also working, I think, collectively on looking at unpacking the box of what makes learning in the classroom happen, and are there some more effective ways of changing pedagogy or introducing lessons that can strengthen what we learn, particularly in those early years that make such a difference going forward. So I think that's the challenge going forward for the next 15 years, to really get better at doing that and put more emphasis on what types of intervention are going to make the biggest difference. So I think it's not really a narrowing of the agenda. We've heard a lot today. It's more really about making sure we get that foundation learning of reading, writing in place, so that we equip children and empower them to go on to do the broader learning and the broader quality that we all aspire to. Which answers a bit your question on education for what? I think it's about the foundations initially, but then it's also about developing some of the soft skills that children are going to need for the next coming future, the next decade, really. We are seeing that, there's a quote that says that we still don't, in many countries, you don't actually know what the future jobs are going to be in 20, 15 years' time. So how do you prepare now? It's not about necessarily really concrete technical skills, it's really having the flexibility to know how to learn, to be adaptable and agile. And then last, I think there's a real question on the counterfactual, which is how do we know whether we could have done better or could we have done more? And I think that comes back to this real question on financing, and not just about more financing, but really are we using the financing we do have as well as we can? So, David, if I may, can I suggest a fifth S to add to your 4 S's, which is, can we use the funding smartly and really work on the efficiency and effectiveness angle?
Thank you. Angela.
It's very easy to talk ourselves into an overly negative position. I was doing extensive in-depth research in Tanzania in 2002 to 2003 at the time that they were implementing a primary education development plan that was funded because of the Education for All international agenda. And you saw classrooms popping up all over the place. You saw more teachers going into schools. You saw what they were doing, mainly due to a kind of patchwork of NGO-supported initiatives, but you saw what they were doing in some classrooms changing. And when I spoke to teachers about the history of their schools, you got a picture of a period in which loads of schools were being built in the 1970s, then this stagnation through the mid to late 1980s, 1990s, and now they were expanding and they were building more classrooms and they had more children and they had more teachers. So yes, aid can make a difference, and we need to understand the conditions under which it makes a difference. Africa is different from Scandinavia. Also, different places within Africa are different from each other. I'm supervising someone who's been doing work with teachers in Lagos, and some of them, they're secondary school teachers, but they're telling him, well, before I was a secondary school teacher, I was a primary school teacher. And the education that I got in the teacher training college was much better pedagogically than what I got in the university. So we need to look at and build on the strengths that there are around the world and within countries, and not say, oh no, there's a problem, and then let's try and come in with a solution. The benefits of education, there's two answers to that. One is, well, we're moving into the Sustainable Development Goal era, where the education goal and its targets are embedded within a broader Sustainable Development Agenda with 17 goals. It should be much more clear and much more explicit how education contributes towards those goals. And I believe I've heard you say, Erin, that's one of the things that the GEM report will do. Of course, the other answer is to talk to the people who have been educationally disadvantaged. They'll tell you what an education is for. Dr. Adela Raymond recently finished a PhD study working with women in a very poor Maasai community in Tanzania, asking about girls' education. And they knew they hadn't been able to participate in an education. Their daughters were being excluded from education. They knew what the benefits of an education were. It was being able to interact with society beyond their village. It was being able to find ways to economically survive. If you can sell your goods in the local market town because you can speak a language that's spoken by more than the people within your tribe, then you're going to, economically, you're going to thrive, and socially as well. The flip question is, what are the costs of not educating? This is why Bridget was saying that DFID is working with refugees from Syria, because we know that the costs of those children not being in school and the alternative that is available for them is pretty grim, and it doesn't bode well for the future of society. Thank you.
A couple very briefly, I mean, there was a dominant discourse, I'd say, about 3 or 4 years ago, which really put all of the attention on the assessment of learning outcomes, and often in quite a narrow way. It's not that assessment is not important, but there was too much of a de-link, or so much attention focused on assessment of learning outcomes without enough or equivalent attention being paid to how do you improve learning outcomes. And these are different things. If you want to really focus on improving learning outcomes, you have a different form of assessment, more likely formative assessment, a bigger focus on teachers and professional development of teachers, because that's where you're going to have a stronger connection between the assessment and the actual improvement of learning. And I think that we're seeing a move in that direction. It's not that assessment is not important, but that we need to be clearer about what are the means by which we're going to see that connection to improving of learning outcomes. And I think putting teachers much more at the centre again is something which I think the GMR last year helped to do, and I think is something which we need to continue to do going forward. I think just on what is education for, well, I think it's for the full development of the human personality. The rights-based frameworks articulate that very clearly, and it does seem to me that there is a danger that we end up focusing too narrowly on the economic returns for education, having been a hegemonic sort of obsession in the recent years, and it has to be across the full SDGs. It's about the social, the environmental, political dimensions, but it's a human personality, it's a personal development as well, and let's not just see it as a utilitarian thing for something else, but it's a value in itself, and we need to make sure that education systems are really genuinely contributing to the development of the full human personality.
A lovely way to end. Thank you, David. Thanks, Angeline, Bridget, and to Aaron as well. If you could all thank them very much.